The JD Vance and Adam Schiff confrontation was never just a clash between a vice president and a Democratic senator. It became important because it turned one of the oldest arguments in American politics into a fresh and dangerous question. When an administration says it is fighting fraud, abuse, and corruption, how do you tell the difference between genuine reform and partisan weaponization before the machinery is already moving? That is the real story. Not simply Vance taking on a bigger governing role. Not simply Schiff criticizing Trump world power the way he has done for years. But a deeper struggle over whether the language of accountability is being used to clean up the state or to turn the state into a more disciplined instrument against political enemies. That is why this pair matters. Because Vance is not merely the vice president. He is increasingly being used to carry the moral justification for a harder second-term Trumpism. And Schiff is not merely another Democratic critic. He remains one of the most recognizable public symbols of the argument that institutions still need defenders willing to say when executive power is sliding into something more coercive and less accountable. When those two figures collide, the disagreement stops being abstract. It becomes a fight over who gets to name abuse first. Recent developments sharpened that fight. Reuters reported that Trump launched a national anti-fraud task force led by Vance and then said Vance would focus fraud efforts on Democratic-run states. That matters because it takes a familiar right-wing complaint, waste, corruption, loose governance in blue states, and gives it a more formal executive structure. At the same time, Reuters reported that Schiff has remained active in challenging the administration across multiple fronts, from suspicious market trading questions to data privacy concerns and conflict of interest oversight. Put simply, Vance is being empowered to investigate. Schiff is trying to make the country ask what kind of investigating this really is. That is the confrontation. Vance wants the public to see democratic governance as a protected zone of waste, fraud, and elite excuses that only a more aggressive executive branch can expose. Schiff wants the public to see that same executive aggression as a warning sign that anti-corruption language is becoming a cover for selective targeting, pressure politics, and democratic erosion. That is not a small disagreement. That is a battle over the moral meaning of enforcement itself. To understand why it matters, start with Vance. Vance's strength is that he does not sound embarrassed by using state power in a more openly partisan atmosphere. He belongs to a right that increasingly believes the old etiquette of neutrality served its enemies better than it served its voters. In that worldview, agencies, regulators, universities, media systems, and bureaucracies already act politically while pretending not to. So why keep honoring a code that only one side truly follows? Why not say openly that misrule clusters in certain places, that corruption clusters in certain institutions, and that government ought to pursue those clusters instead of tiptoeing around them? That is how Vance makes hard power sound like realism. He tells supporters the old language of independence and nonpartisanship has become a shield for systems that already lean left in practice. Once you accept that premise, the anti-fraud task force stops sounding unusual. It starts sounding overdue. Schiff hears something very different. He hears a government that is normalizing target selection first and justification second. He hears a style of politics that says if an opponent is symbolically useful enough, investigative pressure itself can become part of the message. Schiff's political identity has long depended on insisting that some lines still matter even when polarization is intense. He is often mocked by the right for that posture. But the reason he matters is that he keeps asking the same uncomfortable question: when does accountability stop being accountability and start becoming retaliation with paperwork? That question is especially relevant now because the broader Trump world climate has already made many critics feel that old enemies lists are becoming more operational. Reuters has separately documented the administration's wider retribution atmosphere, and Schiff himself has already lived for years as one of the right's preferred symbols of the investigative order it once discredited. So when he warns about politicized oversight, he is not speaking from theory alone. He is speaking as someone who understands how quickly a public target can become an institutional target. That is what gives the Vance-Schiff pair real dramatic force. Vance says the old system protected itself by calling all serious scrutiny dangerous. Schiff says the new system wants to call all dangerous targeting reform. Those claims mirror each other almost perfectly. And that is why the public keeps getting trapped between them. There is also a style contrast here that matters. Vance speaks like someone who wants to strip away false innocence. His rhetoric carries contempt for process language when process language sounds like delay or camouflage. Schiff speaks like someone who wants to preserve the difference between process and vendetta. His whole warning is that once the difference collapses, democracies do not always recognize the damage until much later. That makes them ideal foils. Vance turns democratic alarm into proof that the old guard fears real scrutiny. Schiff turns Vance's confidence into proof that the new guard feels too comfortable with coercive discretion. Both know exactly what they are doing. There is another reason the pair matters: it reveals how anti-corruption politics has changed. In a healthier political environment, anti-corruption campaigns are supposed to build trust by proving rules apply broadly. In a low-trust environment, anti-corruption language can do something darker. It can tell one side that all the rot lives over there, inside those states, those agencies, those networks, those opponents. Once that happens, the appeal of anti-corruption stops depending on procedural fairness. It starts depending on the emotional satisfaction of seeing the right people pressured. Vance is dangerous because he understands that satisfaction. Schiff is useful to his side because he understands the danger embedded in it. That is why neither man can easily dismiss the other. Vance cannot wave Schiff away as just another liberal scold, because Schiff represents a whole vocabulary of institutional alarm that still resonates with educated, procedural, anti-Trump audiences. Schiff cannot dismiss Vance as merely a younger culture warrior, because Vance now carries office, structure, and real executive reach. This is also why the pair belongs in long form rather than a quick segment. The issue is not whether Vance says fraud and Schiff says abuse. The issue is that both are fighting to monopolize the moral high ground around scrutiny itself. Vance wants enforcement to feel finally honest. Schiff wants skepticism of enforcement to feel finally necessary. One side says the rot has been coddled. The other says the cure is becoming indistinguishable from selective punishment. That is a serious constitutional and psychological fight. It also has a 2028 shadow. Vance is building a regime in which executive willingness and ideological confidence feed each other. Schiff is part of a democratic coalition still trying to figure out how to oppose that kind of power without sounding trapped in old defensive formulas. If Vance keeps making executive aggression sound clean and commonsensical, the right's future grows stronger. If Schiff and figures like him can make selective enforcement feel frightening again, the administration's language of reform becomes harder to sell. That is what this pair is really about. Not just one task force. Not just one senator's warning. But a larger question of democratic survival in a time when everyone claims to be cleaning up corruption and almost nobody trusts the other side's cleanup. Vance says the system needs harder hands. Schiff says harder hands without credible limits become a danger of their own. Vance believes blue state elites deserve exposure. Schiff believes exposure can become a ritual pretext for intimidation. Vance wants voters to hear urgency. Schiff wants voters to hear caution before urgency becomes excuse. That is why the confrontation remains alive. Because America has not resolved whether its deepest problem is too little executive aggression against corrupt systems, or too much willingness to dress partisan pressure up as integrity. Until it resolves that question, the Vance-Schiff clash will keep returning in new forms. And every time it does, the stakes will feel larger than the immediate headline. Because the fight is really over who gets to use the language of reform without being suspected of revenge.